Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to our first research seminar of the Easter term. And very pleased to welcome you here, whether you're in the room or joining us online today. My name is Graham Budd. I'm the Executive Director of the Prebiotic Institute for Science and Religion. And just a few quick notes on housekeeping for those of you who are in the room. If there's a fire alarm, then please assemble outside in the car park through the exit where you came in. If you need the toilets, they're down the corridor this way on your right. And just note that after we finish, there is a bookshop here which takes credit cards if you want to fly out to the seminar. So we will have some time for questions after the seminar has finished. So for those of you who are online, you can type your questions into the Q&A field. Try not to use the chat, use the Q&A field, and you can do that at any time, and then we will hopefully be able to take a selection of questions from online and in the room later on. Obviously, if you're in the room, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions in person. So I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Paul Rimmer as our speaker today, and he's going to be talking on the topic of the origin of life, chance, necessity, or design. So quick introduction, let me just introduce Paul. Paul's an assistant professor of experimental astrophysics at the Cavendish Laboratory at the University of Cambridge here. He's building a star in a lab, and he uses that lab to search for comfortable places in this universe to start new life. Paul is married and father of two sons. He's a planetary astrochemist by training. Paul is a Christian by religion. Philosophically, he is a Platonist who thinks that all material things are either atoms or made out of atoms.
Yeah,
Paul, very good to welcome you to the Friday day at this seminar.
Awesome.
Good to see you.
great, thank you. All right. Really grateful for the opportunity and grateful for all of you for showing up. I'm going to start a bit by saying, so I am a scientist by profession. God and family are most important to me, but science is what I end up spending a lot of time doing. I'm very curious about the universe. I tend to spend a lot of time doing science in the lab, or lately, actually, I've been spending a lot of time advising graduate students and postdocs who have been doing the science in the lab, but they've been doing very interesting things. I don't usually enter into the public square. This is one of the few times where I'm kind of stepping a little bit outside of my comfort zone. I do think that it's just good to disclose a bit my sort of general agenda, just so that you know where I'm coming from about this. And my agenda is threefold, and this is hierarchical, so most important, second, third. The most important thing for me when stepping into the public square, which I usually just do sort of one-on-one, is evangelism. I really love Jesus, and I would like other people to love Jesus. And so from that standpoint, if someone walked away saying, I just don't buy this origin story, if I'm kind of interested in this Jesus person, I still consider that a win. But even if they said, well, I'm not really interested in finding out more about how God interacts with the world and about Jesus and everything, but I am interested in origins. That's not quite as much of a win, but that would be my second agenda, is to just get people interested in the subject. Even if you disagree with certain aspects about it or skeptical. Skepticism is a good attitude in science, actually. But so long as you just want to engage and really learn about what people are doing. The third is persuasion. I would like to persuade you that there is, in fact, real progress. And there's a real sort of empirical grounding that you can grasp a hold of involved with origins research. We're still in the early days about that, but that's something that's very much developing and becoming more and more of the story, is actual ways to test these sorts of ideas in the lab, in observations on Earth and other planets in our solar system, and eventually, someday, hopefully, with exoplanet observations. All right, so now stepping into the sort of public square, it turns out origins is very interesting for people who don't work on it for their research careers. And in fact, it has become a sort of topic involved with the sort of culture war, especially in the United States. There's a lot of interest in certainly getting creationism taught in the public schools or various other things like this. And very, very interestingly, origins has kind of gotten folded into this. There's actually a very interesting book on origins written by a couple authors, one of which I think was involved with the pandas and people later on. So there's this interesting sort of connection. And most of that, I think, is crosstalk. I think that a lot of the things that they're interested in are not the things that I, as a researcher, are interested in, and a lot of other researchers would not be interested in. But there's some overlap. And the particular overlap that I'll be talking about today is on the topic of chance, necessity, or design. And in fact, some of the people who have been connected with the sort of culture war side of things, I'm thinking of people like Dembski, Axe, Meyer, these sorts of people have made interesting, sometimes scientific or philosophical and intellectual contributions to this particular topic where this intersection lies. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. So first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the sort of history of chance, necessity, and design. It turns out that these are not new categories. These aren't categories that people came up with in the last year or the last decade or the last century or even the last couple millennia. The first, thanks to Rope Kojonen, who's done interesting work on this. This is the earliest reference that at least I know of for this, which comes from Xenophon's Socrates in Memorabilia. But now, if you had two sorts of things, one of which presents no clue as to what it is for, and the other is obviously for some useful purpose, which would you judge to be the result of chance, which of design? And it's not just Xenophon. In fact, Aristotle ended up making a distinction between chance and necessity in his physics book 2, which I find absolutely fascinating. Philo on the creation talks about the difference between chance and design. It wasn't, at least as far as I, and more importantly, as far as Rope can tell, until around the Middle Ages with figures like Maimonides. Harry Wolfson wrote a very interesting paper looking over this. Maimonides actually talks about chance, necessity, and design, all three. Ed Fazer claims that Thomas Aquinas makes these same sorts of distinctions, though not using that same language. But we don't get to this in Origins, largely because Origins didn't exist as a sort of scientific idea until quite a bit later, until around the 1920s, when it was more a theoretical sort of idea. Although Darwin hypothesized about the warm little pond even earlier. But it didn't become experimental science until Miller and Urey's experiment in the 1950s. And so those sort of categories applied there didn't really apply until later. And as far as I know, chance and necessity is really one of the first places where this was applied to. Origins, although most of this book is about evolution, there is an interesting discussion about origins there that we can get into a little bit. Christian de Duvet has done a very interesting sort of recast of some of Jacques Monod's arguments. So yeah, I should have mentioned Jacques Monod wrote Chance and Necessity, Nobel Prize winner, one of the sort of founders of molecular biology. But chance, necessity, and design applied to this, as far as I can tell, was first by Stephen Meyer, who's currently part of the Discovery Institute. But at the time he came up with this, he was actually at University of Cambridge. He got a PhD. And his PhD thesis is actually fascinating reading. You can get a hold of a copy here. I actually find it to be a lot more elucidating and actually a lot more of a humble and careful read than his later book, Signature in the Cell. This thesis came out in 1991, and he really does set up the sort of chance, necessity, design, along with this interesting idea about inference to the best explanation. So that's the sort of history. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the exclusiveness of chance, necessity, and design. Are these actually exclusive categories? If something's chance, that means it's not necessary. If something's necessary, that means it's not chance or design. If something's design, it means it can't be chance or necessity. That's the first thing that I'm going to end up talking about. But first, I'm going to do a little bit of an experiment. This is called the Briggs-Rauscher oscillating reaction, and hopefully you'll see why. So basically, the way in which this is going to work is you start out with iodine. And the iodines are in the form of iodate. They are very, very oxidized. There's chemistry in here, specifically hydrogen peroxide, which ends up reducing that to iodine molecules, which have an oxidation state of 0. Those have a particularly interesting color, as we'll see. And then, those will ultimately get further reduced to iodide, in which case the color will disappear. Hopefully you see this happening. Good. And the neat part is you can actually see little patches changing at different places. It's actually quite complex. There's a lot of structure in there. A lot of times people will try to wipe out this sort of structure by, if you heat it, you get much more of a stark color change. And if you mix it, the color happens all at once. It looks a lot more dramatic, but you miss actually a lot of the sort of details of this. I'll hold this up. There might be one more transition that gets through. You also start to notice bubbles. A lot of that is oxygen. A little bit of that is also carbon dioxide. This reaction does not run forever. So, as it turns out, it's not a perpetual motion machine, unfortunately. So that particular reaction, I gave you the simple description. And what happens is that the sort of rate constants that are involved, the ways in which these things move, change over time, and that's what creates this sort of oscillation. Just saying that, though, doesn't give you much of an understanding. In reality, that chemistry involves over 30 different reactions working in sequence involving ions, radicals, and different molecules. And it's actually not entirely understood. It's still an area of active research about how exactly that chemistry works. So I'm going to open it up a little bit to just a short discussion. Did what I just show you, was that chance, necessity, or design? Welcome, especially any of the younger members of the audience who'd like to just maybe speculate a little bit about what you think. Oh, great, please.
Maybe it depends on what level you're talking about it, because I mean, you kind of designed the experiment by putting things together.
Yes, I did. Yeah, so it seems like design from that standpoint. In what level would you look at it and say maybe not so much?
Maybe at the actual reaction step that was necessary, but again, kind of on a certain level, like if you take for granted the realities of the universe, then it was necessarily going to happen like that. Yeah, then maybe the actual fact that the universe is set up this way such that those things would happen is by chance or maybe by design. That's
excellent. That's a wonderful answer, actually. In fact, saves me quite a bit of time talking through certain things, because that's pretty much what it was that I was going to say. Is that it seems like necessity from a certain level. If I took exactly the same conditions, put them together in exactly the same way, the exact thing would happen. But I can't quite do it the same way. And it turns out, because I've now done this experiment about 5 times in preparation, each of those 5 times, it turns out a little different. Sometimes the color's a bit stronger. The patterns are always different. And on a deeper level, on the microscopic level, I'd say it's very chancy, because you have all these atoms and molecules that are bouncing around. I don't know how they're happening. Certainly on this deeper level, you could say this is due to some sort of determined quantity, but actually referencing certain distinctions that Dennis Alexander happens to make, is, you might say that this is epistemic chance. For all I know, the way I would think about it would be chance, because I don't know where all those molecules are. But maybe on some deeper level, you would say this isn't really chance. It might still be contingent. Nothing's really set up, say, the sort of universe so that that exact thing has to happen. But you would still say maybe that's not quite a sort of fundamental chance, but it's chance as far as I can tell. The way that I treat it is these things kind of randomly happen. But on the macroscopic scale, it looks quite orderly. And there are certain patterns there that look much more like, you would say, necessity. And it's designed, I mean, these chemicals didn't make themselves. Other people made the chemicals. These chemicals didn't mix themselves, I mixed them. And I would actually say, even on a deeper level, the really complicated thing about this, and the place where my own design intuition really takes hold, is more on the level of the reactions. The real intricacy of it is what's actually happening there. And so if design intuition matters in that sense, I would say that my design intuition sits much more strongly, a much more intellectually powerful designer was involved in what actually happened with the reactions and what happened with any of the steps preceding. This is something I would even call the signature of the divine, quoting Marilyn Robinson from her new book, Genesis. It's worth talking a little bit more about these sorts of categories. I'll talk about them briefly. There's the necessity of the philosophers, and then there's the necessity of the scientists. These are different things. The necessity of the philosophers, at least in more contemporary analytic philosophy, a lot of this I got from Saul Kripke's Naming a Necessity, comes from the sort of concept of logical necessity, and it comes from thinking about many worlds. These aren't real worlds, at least not for Kripke. Certain philosophers think they are, but these are possible worlds, things that could have been different. It could have been, for example, that someone else was prime minister now, that Hillary Clinton won a particular election, that I didn't actually show up for the talk today, that this experiment failed utterly, which is exactly what I would have said if that actually happened. All these things fit into these sorts of imagined sets of possible worlds. And you can think about the widest set of possible worlds, meaning any world is a possible world if it doesn't involve a logical self-contradiction. So that's the logical possibility. And so you can talk about necessity versus contingency in that sort of context. If in all logically possible worlds, something is the same over all of them, then that's logically necessary. If it's different in some and not the others, then that's logically contingent. There's something a little bit deeper, which is metaphysical necessity. There are certain ideas like the identity of indiscernibles. If I have two things that have exactly all the same properties, including being located in the same place and everything else, you say that's the same thing. Now, you can say, well, maybe there's a possible world where that principle doesn't work. And maybe that's a logically possible world. Maybe there isn't a deep contradiction involved in denying that particular principle, but it still seems like that's some kind of metaphysical truth. And so I'd want to narrow my gaze down to sort of what's metaphysically necessary in that sense. And then there's finally nomological necessity, which is mostly about what scientists think about, which is given the laws of physics that we have now, whatever those happen to be, given the way that our universe is structured, what is necessary and what is actually contingent about it. I could have used a different set of chemicals here. I could have used them in different ratios. But if I do use them in those particular ratios in that way, given the way thermodynamics and the laws of chemistry work, it's going to come out roughly the same way. And that's the sort of idea about nomological necessity. With chance, there are varieties of chance that I've already discussed, so I won't need to go into much detail about this, except just to encourage reading some of Dennis Alexander's work on this. But there's the way that he distinguishes, and he's in the room, so he can correct me if I mess this up, but it's epistemic, ontological, and metaphysical chance. We already talked about the epistemic chance, chance for all we know. There might be ontological chance. We can't really know that for sure, but there could be ontological chance in the sense of there are radioisotopes that decay. That seems to be a random thing. The two-slit experiment measuring particular spins of quantum states and things, that seems to be just like truly random. You would say that that's objectively or ontologically random. And then there's metaphysical chance, which I'm mostly just going to set aside, except as a sort of warning. I pretty much agree with Dennis on this. I think that metaphysical chance is, thinking about chance as a sort of agency. It's actually doing something. Chance doesn't really do anything. Molecules do things, atoms do things, forces do things, fields might do things, people do things. There are lots of agents. But chance is just a way of describing the behavior of things. It's not actually an agency that does stuff. And some people talk about it as though it is. So then we can move to design and varieties of divine agency. When I think about design, I'm going to be talking about divine agency at this point. I'll touch a little bit on a different sort of design. So processes explained by chance and necessity could also require explanations of design, regardless of the activity of the designer, God, going all the way from deism to occasionalism. A good example that I like to think of that I got from Rope Konashen's really nice book about the compatibility of evolution and design is if I build a car with my own hands, then that's clearly designed. If I build a car making factory, if I make the factory, then the factory makes the car. Do I say the car was still designed? I would, but that doesn't explain to me maybe all the details of how the car really got there. I might be really interested in the details of the factory. It wasn't directly designed, but still design is an important part of the full explanation. This is showing how these ideas clearly are not so exclusive. What I'm going to do for the rest of this is I'm going to assume something is a toy model. That's a physics speak for I think the model's wrong, but it's right in a certain regime and in a certain conceptually useful way for helping me to talk about and think about other things. The toy model I'm going to use is something called occasionalism. It's not necessarily a toy model, by the way. There are a lot of serious theologians, especially in the Islamic tradition, that have taken occasionalism very seriously. Occasionalism is the idea that God causes absolutely everything. So God's responsible for all of this stuff. Trivially, that means design is not only not exclusive, it's exhaustive. So everything is designed in that sense. I think that this diffuses a lot of the ID-related concerns that you might have about the subject that we come into, because in that sense, you do really have design everywhere. One thing that I'll also just mention a little bit about the sort of history, Shoaib Malik has written a really nice book about Islam and evolution, which talks a little bit about how certain Islamic thinkers interface with this and how evolution interfaces with this idea that God causes absolutely everything. Oliver Crisp has a nice essay that he published in 2016 about Jonathan Edwards, where he actually talks about how Jonathan Edwards, the Calvinist, also was a complete occasionalist. He thought God did absolutely everything. So there's a good Christian history in this as well. It's not just a silly concept. That's not what I mean by toy model. By toy model, it means that there's certain aspects of that that I personally just don't entirely buy, but I find it useful for approaching this sort of subject as a sort of limiting case. So I would say that, again, diffuses ID-related concerns. Any model that has God acting in the lab the same way as in the natural environment, by the way, would do the same thing. So you could have different sorts of models about this that would diffuse the sort of concerns about certain origins research. This is not the same as methodological naturalism. This could be related in certain ways. You might actually get the same sort of product when you're actually in the lab doing science. But there's a very important sense in which this is almost the opposite of methodological naturalism. It's sort of a methodological theism of some sort. It's almost when you investigate science, you're figuring out the regularities of the behavior of the God who made us all, who sustains us all, and in fact, who is making everything from moment to moment. But this does make this trivially exhaustive. And so now I'm going to move into talk about the exclusiveness, and I'll talk about the exhaustiveness. Are these the only three options? Is it just chance, necessity, or design? Or could there be other options too? So given occasionalism, actually, those are the only three. In fact, I only need one. Everything's designed. But we can still make distinctions within that. There are still things that seem chancy and things that seem more like necessity. Are those exhaustive? Maybe there's a third category that's still designed, but neither chance nor necessity. And there are other models of divine activity that distinguish between primary and secondary causes. Some events may not be caused directly by God in those sorts of models. To me, it seems like the non-mechanical nature of life. There's a really nice paper by Nicholson about this. Life is not a machine. Life is something else, something far more magnificent than a machine. It's convergent evolution. Art Louis has written about this from a scientific standpoint. Certainly, Simon Conway Morris really helps to come up with a lot of these concepts for animal evolution. Again, Rope Konashen writes about this more from a sort of philosophical, theological perspective. But those sorts of things to me kind of admit to purpose, a sort of teleology. Purpose language isn't exactly folded into either chance or necessity. And I would say, depending on who's talking about design, that kind of purpose language isn't necessarily folded into design either. It seems like something else. Teleology has been really popular in certain philosophical schools, especially Thomism. Ed Feser writes about this. Dehaan also has a really nice essay about this in a particular collected volume. The teleological and teleonomical approach is also gathering interest among scientists. I mentioned a book by Peter Corning, Stuart Kaufman, Dennis Noble, Jane Shapiro, Richard Van Wright, and Addie Cross, called Evolution on Purpose. It just came out at MIT Press. And they're really talking about how this teleology and teleonomy is really interfacing with both the evolutionary concept and, especially in Addie Cross's case, the concept of origin of life. Stepping a little bit further back, going actually back to the sort of comment about the origin of the universe part, cosmological fine-tuning, such as that written by Lewis and Barnes in 2016, actually Cambridge University Press. That also seems like the sort of thing that wouldn't really have explanation entirely in terms of chance and necessity, but seems to require maybe some other sort of category. Something that you might say is definitely connected with design and could be evidence of design, but still something that involves some other sort of explanation. So now with all of that sort of background, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start moving a little bit more into where my own research field is, but again, from the standpoint of comparing this to these sorts of concepts and how these different concepts interface. So I'm going to present a sort of origin of life scenario. Before I do that, we need some context. I really recommend two particular books, one called From Strange Simplicity to Complex Familiarity by Manfred Eigen. This is a really good book about origins of life from the information perspective, from the perspective of where did this information come from? How does this information propagate? It is mathematically fairly heavy. Manfred Eigen, the Nobel laureate chemist who did work on measuring rate constants of various enzymes. Almost right afterward, did some really interesting work on the error threshold, which is really important for origins. And then later in 2008, he ended up writing this particular book. I think the 2013 one is the second edition. Fehrenbach and Cleves in 2024, this is Oxford University Press, the other press, write about origin of life more from the geochemistry and prebiotic chemistry kind of standpoint. I think both of those work really well in concert. One is a lot more mathematically heavy and maybe a little harder to get into than others. But even if you can't get through all the math, it was still written for a wide audience. Just skipping over the equations and reading some of the insights is very valuable, I think, for anybody who is interested in this particular field. So I'm going to start with some assumptions. I'm going to say that life is made of chemistry. If you disagree, this isn't going to go much further. In this particular, we can have a very interesting conversation afterward, but life is made of chemistry. Now, that does not mean life is chemistry. I like to think about C.S. Lewis's example of the star. You know, even in your world, that's not what stars are. That's just what they're made of. Life is made of chemistry, but life itself is not chemistry. But it's important to know that life is made of chemistry, because otherwise a lot of the justification for what we're looking into doesn't make a lot of sense. The origin of life is at core then a synthetic chemistry problem. That's what it is right at the center. But it involves many other fields. You can't just use any chemistry. You can't just use look at any particular desired outcomes, just put anything into the system, involve any sort of interference. There are some things that have to work certain ways that are informed by geochemistry, astronomy, biology, certainly, because that's kind of where the whole thing is aiming. So it involves many other fields. This is an interdisciplinary field. It has not been solved. That's a very important thing. Its origins of life is far from being solved. And so this is so different approaches should be dealt with great epistemic humility. There have been a couple of great papers about this by Marina Prainer in 2020 and Nick Lane and Javier in 2024, actually, just this year. So the next thing I'm going to assume is that life originated without the involvement or interference of a finite intelligent agent. Given my assumption of occasionalism, everything's, but there was no occasioned appearance of a finite intelligent agent being involved. That's an assumption. That's a testable assumption. There are things you could look into to actually test that, which are interesting to talk about, but not at present. I'm The softest assumption I have, though, is that life originated on Earth. So all this is going to be in the context of Earth. We don't know that either. Life could have originated on Mars and hitched a ride, originated on comets, various other things. There are other scenarios, but that's one of the assumptions I'm going to make here. And then I'm going to talk about, so there are 4 things life as we know it needs. In fact, I think there are 4 things all life will need, but I'll talk about it in the context of life as we know it, because this is the only example that I have. Life needs some sort of informational polymer. It needs some way to store information and to translate that information, copy it with very, very high accuracy, but not perfect accuracy. It's perfect accuracy. You can't have evolution. There's no change. But if it's low accuracy, then the children don't look enough like the parents, and then there's nothing to be inherited. This is done by this particular kind of molecule. This is a ribonucleotide. There's a small alteration I could make to this, removing one of these, and maybe the deoxyribonucleotide. It has a phosphate group, a sugar, and a base, of which there are 4/5 to choose from. These end up pairing with each other, and that's where you get this sort of informational system. You also need chemical control. Life is, although it's very complex, it's complex in a very ordered way, where local things are actually simplified greatly compared to what they would otherwise be. Not all reactions happen, only those reactions which promote this homeostasis that life needs, or promotes particular functions that life is particularly after. Largely, this is done by proteins, which are made of amino acids, like this one, alanine. And these also have a couple different parts. They have these side chains. They have these groups with these oxygens and hydrogens, and then they have an amine over here. Some of this can also be controlled by RNA. Finally, you need a container. You need something to hold life together. And this isn't really a phospholipid. This has to be a bit longer, but I ran out of carbons. But this is like a short phospholipid, an almost phospholipid, which has a phosphate group. And then it has this long sort of hydrocarbon group. One side is polar, likes water. One side is apolar, doesn't like water. And so these make these sorts of bilayers, and these are what membranes cells are largely made out of. And then you need a metabolism. You need some way to break the simple molecules apart and to take them and build these larger molecules, or you need some way to take large molecules, break them apart, store that energy. That energy can then be used to make these sorts of molecules. And it turns out that there are a lot of scenarios centered around these things. That's why I'm emphasizing these. It's a bit of a reductionist way to think about life, to be honest, but we're thinking about what life is made of first. And so, but each one of these has camps. There's the RNA world camp. There is the protein world or amyloid world hypothesis camp. There's the lipid world camp. There's the metabolism first camp. It used to be in Origins that they'd all sit in 4 corners of a room during conferences and yell insults at each other. Things have gotten a bit better, partially because we now understand more about life, and it's actually quite hard to separate all of these things. Membranes actually have proteins and nucleotides embedded in them. The ribozyme, which actually builds the proteins, is largely made out of RNA, but not exclusively. All of these things all have all these different parts, and they're all kind of integrated together. So life has, as we know, it has all these things mixed up, creates all sorts of chicken and egg problems. So I'm going to move into a scenario where I think we can actually get all of these different parts. I don't know how they all get together at the end of the day, but I do know at least how to get one way in which you can get all of these different parts. And I'm going to tell it to you like a story. I'm not going to actually go into a lot of the scientific data. Some of these are experimentally based. Some of these are based on observation of Earth's geological records. Some of these are based on models. I'll try to give an idea about what we're more or less certain of was true, could be true, or that we just don't know. But that's why at the very end of this, you'll get a handout, and the handout has all the references in there, and you can really look into this in greater detail. Also, if you just have any questions about any part of this, I'd be happy to discuss that later, but I don't want to break up the narrative too much. So Earth formed roughly 4.5 billion years ago, formed around our sun. We'll just talk about its nebular atmosphere more from where the root word comes from. The atmosphere is uncertain at this point, but doesn't really matter too much because relatively early on, there was a moon forming impact. So whatever was happening on Earth kind of got reset in that moon forming impact. A Mars-sized object rammed into the Earth, got everything mixed all up, and we got the moon. And in addition, when everything got all mixed up, all the iron settled to the center. That took a lot of these iron-loving elements to the center. The iron itself will disproportionate in the mantle. That happens very quickly. What that means is that you get more reducing iron and oxidizing iron. You come up with neutral iron, that's FeO. That will split up into Fe with extra O's and just Fe. The just Fe will sink right to the bottom, and the Fe with the extra O's sticks around. And so what this means is you get a relatively neutral to oxidizing mantle very early on. And this will produce gases, which look very much like CO2, H2O. We would have our N2 atmosphere. This atmosphere is not very good for prebiotic chemistry, as it turns out, and for reasons that you'll be able to see later. But it didn't stay that way. There was another impact. This impact was about a moon-sized object. And this crashed in. And this is made out of this kind of material. There's actually a piece of meteorite. This is an iron meteorite. I'm going to hand this around. You can hand that around and take a look. Oh, here, hold on. Just for the people online. There you are. The iron ended up interacting with the water. And when iron interacts with water, the iron gets oxidized, and the water gets transformed into H2. This is really hot right now. There's a magma ocean, everything else. That H2 will react with CO2 to form methane. It will react with the N2 to form ammonia. So you end up with a very reducing atmosphere. This reducing atmosphere will only last roughly around 1 million years. And the main reason is Earth is too light to keep a hold of all this hydrogen. The hydrogen escapes, and eventually the hydrogen runs out, and everything kind of returns to that neutral atmosphere. Again, within a sort of million-year time frame. Subsequent photochemistry, while we had all this reducing material, would have produced molecules that look like this: hydrogen cyanide and cyanoacetylene in quite large quantities in the atmosphere. These would have rained out, but they would have rained out with probably at least tens of thousands, maybe millions of other molecules, and created this tar. Well, this is very complex. Complexity is kind of like life, right? Well, not this kind of complexity. This kind of complexity you can't really do anything with. Is actually really bad in a different way for origins of life. So after this, though, some of the tar will be incorporated into the crust. Some of it might have been subducted. Some of it might have actually just sunk down. There are ways in which these things can just get sunk down into the crust without a subduction zone. Some of this might have actually just been forced in by subsequent impacts. Another impact hits, and it just forces all this tar down. Tar would be heated by volcanism. And this volcanism would have been fortuitously, I'm going to say fortuitously a lot for a lot of this, because there are some interesting coincidences anyway. It's fortuitously, volcanism at this time was at much higher temperature. A few hundred kelvins higher, or a few hundred centigrade higher than volcanism today. Volcanism today is around 1200, 1300 degrees. Volcanism then was around 1600, even 1700 degrees. At the lower temperature, this would actually just cook everything and would leave pretty much only graphite and inert elements, relatively inert elements in the graphite. At those higher temperatures, it still makes graphite. That's a wonderful thing. It makes graphite, and the only other chemically active species that seem to be left over in large quantities: hydrogen cyanide, cyanoacetylene, and another molecule I don't have time to talk about, but also that turns out to be prebiotically useful. That's really interesting. These bubbles would bubble through this hydrothermal vent. This is the part where I'm going to, there are some things that we know well. There are some things we know less well. This is the part we know a little less well. Will these molecules survive when they bubble up? Let's imagine that they do. This is a good experiment to run. If they don't, they won't be very useful. The surface hydrothermal vents fortuitously meet many of the requirements for a diverse set of prebiotic chemical reactions. And some of these involve photochemistry. So this is when I'm going to go and look at this particular sort of model. You have your hydrogen cyanide, and you have this. This comes from SO2. So you have the volcanism that's bubbling up SO2. The SO2 complexes with water, and you end up with this sulfite. And these are floating around in the water. This doesn't represent a lone pair. This represents the extra electron. ultraviolet light can come in, knock this extra electron off, which will attach itself onto the hydrogen cyanide. This will pick up a proton, probably, well, maybe from, which will attach itself here, which means that one of these bonds is no longer there. This carbon is not completely bonded. This is a radical now. This will pick up another, let's see, I'll grab it from here right now. This will pick up another hydrogen, often actually from the sulfite or from sulfide. You end up with this sort of structure as it looks here. This will hydrolyze almost immediately in water. This doesn't like to stick around because ammonia is much more thermochemically favored. And so this will actually break apart, leaving ammonia, picks up the two hydrogens off of the water, and it takes that one excess water, which is here. So it takes the excess oxygen and it makes formaldehyde. This formaldehyde goes on to do exactly the same chemistry with the cyanide. It will complex with one of the cyanides, making something called glycolonitrile, and do exactly the same chemistry to form glycolaldehyde. And it makes all of this fairly selectively, and it makes all of these in these fairly high yields, so long as you have a good sort of relatively non-diverse chemistry to start with. The glycolaldehyde will go through the exact same process once again to make glyceraldehyde. And then you'd be concerned, well, if it keeps doing this, you're going to just keep getting larger and larger sugars. They're going to react with each other. It's going to make a mess. There are two things that help it keep from making a mess. One is, this is just naturally, and for reasons that are not entirely understood, this is just where the chemistry stops. You don't make larger sugars in this. It just doesn't work. No one's exactly sure why, but this right here is the biggest sugar that you make this way. In addition, there are a whole bunch of byproducts. There are ways for these sugars to interact, but we're going to also assume that you have a lot of phosphate in this water. And I think there are plausible reasons to think why you would have this phosphate. If the phosphate's there, it controls the pH to keep this so where the chemistry will be relatively straightforward. And it's also a chemical sort of purifier. It will tend to bond with a lot of the side products and remove them from the system. So now you have this sort of glyceraldehyde. This glyceraldehyde, well, first, actually, let's go back to the glycolaldehyde. The glycolaldehyde here will react with this. This is cyanamide. We don't know where this one comes from, but let's just say that it's somehow there. The cyanamide reacts with the glycolaldehyde, and it will form this ringed structure right here, 2-aminoxyl. And this structure will react with our cyanoacetylene, which we got from our vents here, to form this structure, which I will just call RAO, ribose aminoxazolene, but I'll call it RAO in the future. This is the wrong-handedness of RAO. I did mention earlier that these molecules, and especially important for these ones, have a particular chirality, actually. This particular bond especially, and then these bonds right here have to face a certain way. They all have to face a certain way. It doesn't matter which way, but they all have to face the same way. Otherwise, the sort of structures that you get to copy the information and also to control the chemistry don't work so well. This is the wrong-handedness for at least how our life is. And you actually get these in racemic mixture, which means equal numbers of each handedness. But as it turns out, if you actually have a surface of magnetite that's slightly magnetized, which impacts can generate, the magnetic field of Earth might be able to generate, these will actually crystallize out. And when they crystallize out, they sort themselves out. There are actually a couple other isomers of this. They all sort themselves into the different isomers and the different handedness. Depending on the magnetization of the surface, different handed ones will be bound more tightly or less tightly, and so can then be released into the solution more. These end up magnetizing the surface, and this will actually end up going around in this sort of way, so that in 2 cycles, you get something which is enantiomerically pure. This can then go on and this can react with the phosphate and another cyanoacetylene to give this. Not in such good yields, though. There is still some work to be done with this sort of chemistry. And this actually only produces 2 of the letters of the RNA. A similar chemistry can produce two of the other letters, but for the DNA. We don't know how the rest of the letters came about, but we are getting about half of those. There are different ways in which this chemistry can break off, though. If you have, say, your glycolaldehyde, and you have a lot of ammonia around, and you don't have these other things that you need, you can get some of the amino acids. There are other places, even just with a cyanoacetylene or with a formaldehyde, where you can also get amino acids. Or you can get your glyceraldehyde, and maybe there you actually run out of the ingredients with the glyceraldehyde. This will react with the phosphate and start forming precursors to these things, phospholipids. And in fact, it's been shown that these build up to the point where you can make vesicles out of them. There's a whole bunch of other chemistry that goes on that starts actually even linking these together, sort of in the way that enzymes work, but not quite the same. This works especially well with light, ultraviolet light that is fortuitously like the sun's. If you use different kinds of light, the chemistry is less effective. Specifically, if you use light from M dwarfs, almost no M dwarf can run this chemistry at all, but it runs really well with the sun. So there are some subsequent steps that then actually become important with this. A lot of these steps, it turns out the chemistry doesn't work very well if it's way too hot, although it does require temperature fluctuations. Those will naturally exist in this sort of hydrothermal event. So surface hydrothermal event, much of the hydrothermal event will be whatever temperature and whatever alkalinity the atmosphere is. After the impact, a lot of surface will have been exposed, and this will remove a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere. And so the post-impact atmosphere will actually be very, very cold. Even after the clouds clear and everything else, it's still going to be very cold. There's going to be a lot of ice around. This is useful for quite a bit of this chemistry. The high pH is actually one of the things that helps to guarantee we get a lot of phosphate around. It turns out there are high pH lakes that we know about now. They're almost phosphate saturated because of a very interesting sort of chemical process involving carbonates. It also just happens that the nucleotides that are produced by this photochemistry in abundance are all mixed with certain other nucleotides, different sorts of isomers, different kinds of sugars, and sometimes weird different kinds of bases. If you expose those to UV light, it turns out these are much more resistant to ultraviolet light than any of the others. The ones that life uses are more resistant to ultraviolet light than any of the others. And in this kind of system where you have some of this chemistry, they will actually even spontaneously self-repair, where the other kinds of nucleotides will not. There are many subsequent steps that have not been worked out, though. So that's kind of where the story stops. We link these into little oligomers. How do we do the sort of rest of the work? I'm not sure. These prebiotic chemical networks like this one invoked in the scenario already contain within themselves autocatalytic cycles. This chemistry that we just saw that I showed you actually has an autocatalytic cycle itself. Autocatalytic cycles clearly then are not life. Dennis joked that I might be making life in this. This is not life, but it is an autocatalytic cycle. But autocatalytic cycles are important to life. It's hard to imagine life without an autocatalytic cycle. It seems like a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one. Autocatalytic cycles, by the way, are cycles where the product of the chemistry makes the chemistry go faster, and therefore selects that sort of product, usually. The exhibition of these behaviors might be very highly contingent. There are a lot of different parts to this. You can't do all this chemistry entirely in one pot. You might have to have different streams. The intersections of these different streams might mean that if enough streams are necessary, because this isn't life yet, maybe you need more intersections, more contingent chemistry. The contingency may be great enough that life might be very rare. It might even be unique to Earth, but there are implications for this. And searching on exoplanets and other things will give us an idea about whether those implications are right or not. Finally, some of these systems seem to require a sort of do-nothing chemistry, and they seem to exhibit some of those qualities. They seem to kind of happen in ways where the interference of the chemist can be well modeled by certain natural systems. And so this fits into this idea of do-nothing chemistry, which I cribbed from Masanobu Fukuoka's Do-Nothing Farming, The One Straw Revolution. Very, very interesting book talking about how farming using nature for you rather than against you makes for much better farming. I think chemistry using nature for rather than against does much better chemistry. So many of these steps actually arose because people realized, oh, this one thing I was using wasn't working very well. I need to use something else. That other thing actually ended up enhancing the chemistry. A good example is the sulfite. That works on Earth, on early Earth with the ultraviolet light. They were using sulfide before. Sulfide is much rarer. And sulfide isn't active enough to do the chemistry. They introduced the thing that was more likely. The chemistry ended up getting enhanced. This has actually happened, although I can't go into all of the details, that's actually happened at least 5 times by my count in this particular field. What I would say here is that, first of all, this may not be the only scenario that exhibits this behavior. It may not even be the most likely scenario that exhibits this kind of behavior. But I hypothesize that what I see is a sort of teleological character of many of these sequences in the scenario is a sign of being on the right track. It's a sign that when these things just seem to fit together, where the sort of goal of the prebiotic chemist, the sort of goal of life happens to match what naturally happens, the sort of a natural outcome of the environment. This is a sign of being on the right track. And that future signatures of this kind of teleology will indicate fruitful new research avenues. And I'm planning, actually, I'm taking this approach myself in future research to find out if this really works out. You can ask me in maybe 5 or 10 years, maybe this was a horrible idea and I ended up at a dead end. Maybe it's still a great idea someone else uses, I still end up at a dead end. But maybe this will really lead to fruitful new insight into the way that life might have originated. I will conclude there, and I'll just thank you all and welcome questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul, for that. I think it's the first time we've ever had real chemistry experiment happening in one of these research seminars. I'm pleased to say we've all survived. No, thank you so much for your talk. I'm sure it's stimulated lots of thought for us.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. So I have a background in science teaching in school.
Okay.
And the way origin is taught in school in science is very reductionist. This is how it happens, what we know.
Mm-hmm.
Your approach is much more well convinced possibilities and
Mm-hmm.
so on. Can you comment on that difference in how it's taught in schools and how it's thought about in research circles?
Okay, sure. I would say that my approach is still fairly reductionistic, at least at this stage. Part of that is due to ignorance. I mean, we just don't know how some of the stuff actually builds up and works in a larger sort of structure. A lot of scientists are starting to think about it in that way, I think, with some really, really fruitful results. I would say that more is just that sort of communication of uncertainty, which I think is healthy in science education everywhere. Not knowing is one of the things that got me excited into doing science, because we know all the answers. What's the point in doing any of this stuff? One of the things I got really excited about was in Cosmos, when it was talked about how nobody knows, but maybe one of you will figure it out. I thought, well, that's great. I can go do that. Talking about uncertainty in a way that is responsible, that reflects our actual uncertainty, so that you can express confidence in things we really know well, like COVID-19 vaccinations and global climate change, and the things we don't know so well, like how life really originated, or what the early Earth was really like. Expressing that accurately, I think, is an incredible challenge. I'm not enough of an educator to know how to do that well, but I try my best.
Thank you. That's good.
So we've got a question online. Here. So how does the concentrations of reactants in the absence of an enclosing membrane impact these reactions in water?
That's a very good point. So this is one of the other reasons why I like doing this on these sorts of surface hydrothermal vents. Other hydrothermal vents have the same property. They tend to have these little rock enclosures, which, and there was just a very recent paper by Dieter Braun and Christoph Mast's group out of Munich, where what they do is actually make artificial versions of this by digging these out into a sort of Teflon, and then they put little windows on it. They watch the reactions. In those sorts of areas, it's small enough that you can actually concentrate reactants. And with the temperature gradients you would expect in these rocks, turns out the reactants end up sorting themselves by type. And they just don't even sort themselves by mass, but they seem to sort themselves in ways that are prebiotically relevant, and in ways that even allow the water activity in the presence of water to get low enough so that they can actually start to ligate. So they were able to make diglycine, which I think is the reason they got that published in Nature. It's really, really interesting stuff. I think something like that is a precursor. I do think that getting to vesicles is so important. There are ways in which that can be controlled. There are ways in which the particular interface of the membrane can really help to drive things. There's ways that the surface of the vesicle allows for different kinds of catalytic chemistry that are just not possible in these sorts of rock surfaces. And you really don't want to make the chemistry really complicated in these little rock pores, because the rock pores don't grow, they don't change. And once you make really complicated chemistry, you have to get it out somehow. And it's going to be very, very hard to get it out of some of those. So I do think vesicles are something very important early on, but you eventually have to make them in the first place. And I do think a way of concentrating these reactants first, really, really good in these sorts of surface hydrothermal vents. Not the only place where you can concentrate these, but my preferred place to concentrate in surface chemistry.
Great, thank you. So we do have another question online, but let's go to the room first. Yes, over here.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you can elaborate on what you mean by occasionalism here, because I could see the teleological argument. I'm not sure I could see the job it does in the teleological argument, and you've not used occasionalistic language then in your description because you've kind of given agency to natural things.
That's a very good point. That's just a natural thing that I do because I'm trained as a scientist. One of the ways in which you could imagine is that, so if we do accept occasionalism, then every single one of these sequences has been brought about by direct action by God. And so there's already an intelligence involved. And so we shouldn't be surprised to see chemistry that looks like there was an intelligence involved if that was the case. I think that's too extreme for my own view. My own view is a little bit more optimistic. I tend to see a sort of distinction between primary and secondary causes. But I do think that God does these sorts of direct interventions more often than we might think. I actually think it happened in the birth of both of my children. I think it's the birth of all children, the creation of a new soul, a new personality, a new individual. I think it could happen here, but just like conception and gestation can happen in the lab, and it doesn't mean that those sorts of conceptions don't have souls. It could be that there is a particular step, a place where divine agency happens here, but so long as it happens reliably in the lab, in the same way that it would in the natural environment, I'm going to encapsulate it here. I might be able to see shadows of it in that kind of idea of teleology, that sort of teleological concept, that sort of goal-directedness, how these things seem to line up. I think there's something more than just having set the initial conditions of the universe a certain way and let it play out in a really interesting way. There seems to be more of a divine hand, an eminent divine hand in it, in my mind, but one that I can at least describe the chemistry in a scientific way because that divine hand is reliably there. It's there even in the lab. And so I don't need to have these sorts of arguments where I'm claiming that there's some sort of gap that can't be investigated in the lab there, in which case I couldn't do the science at all.
Wonderful, thank you. So let's go to another question online. So you mentioned smaller stars in relation to chemistry. What about larger stars? What does the UV spectrum do?
Wow. So larger stars are even better at some of this chemistry. And you don't need to worry about if the UV is too strong. And the reason you don't need to worry about it is any of this chemistry could go into a pore and then it doesn't get any UV at all. All of this stuff is very good at absorbing ultraviolet light. So if you have a lot of this near the surface, all you need to just do is go a little further down. You can get rid of a lot of this ultraviolet light very, very easily. The place where this becomes a bit of a problem is that it's actually harder to form planets around these particular stars, certainly when you get to much more massive ones. But if you look at stars that are just a bit more massive than the sun, yeah, the chemistry works great. It works about the same as it would on Earth. A bit better, but these stars themselves are also intrinsically a lot rarer.
Yeah, great, thank you. So we've got time maybe just for 2 more questions. Yeah, please.
You talked about different forms of necessity and how it's possible that certain laws of our universe as we know it might be contingent laws. I've heard a number of people reference the same idea. Is there anything that that you're aware of, the scientists talk about certain like chemical processes or chemical laws that are founded on perhaps stronger forms of necessity and ones that are maybe weaker? Can you point to specific things that might be otherwise in other universes and ones that maybe perhaps are not?
That's a really interesting question. I'm probably going to give you a not very satisfying answer because it wouldn't happen so much in the chemistry for me. I can look at a correlation, like there are certain chemical principles that just seem to almost always hold, but a lot of these sort of chemical laws are littered with exceptions. It's one of the reasons organic chemists, which I am not, by the way, but I work with them. Most of them have incredible memories. Quite a few of the best ones have virtually photographic memories. And the reason for that is, one of them is because they need to know both the laws and all the huge list of exceptions. the place where I would actually look at this more would be going to my own training in physics and actually looking at sort of origins of the universe and thinking about those sorts of laws and the way those are set up. It does seem as though some of those are more finely tuned than others. Some of those require certain constants that seem to be arbitrary constants, but that only a small range allows for the existence of life. Some of these seem to be based more on maybe more fundamental principles. And so I would say that some of those might be considered more contingent than others, or maybe those others are just contingent, but they're contingent on yet prior sorts of laws. So I'd probably look a bit more there, but that might just be an effect of my training. I may not know enough about the organic chemistry to point out particular places where it seems as though organic chemistry is driven more by necessity versus contingency. It's a really interesting question. I have to think about it.
Okay, let's just finish with one last question from online. So, question is, why did you say that the assumption that no finite intelligent agent was involved is testable?
Oh, yeah.
In what way is it testable?
So, so it's testable in this sense. All I need to do is find out that a finite intelligent agent was involved, and then I falsified, right? So one way that could happen, here's an outlandish way. We've been sending out signals. We don't do that very much anymore because we're worried about what in intelligent life elsewhere might say, but we can send out, say, signals a lot, and we might get a signal back. And through communication, we might be told a convincing story by aliens. Oh, we populated this galaxy, and we populated your planet too. Thank you very much. That would definitely falsify that sort of idea. A more direct way might be that there could, in fact, be more of a sort of finite signature in the cell. You could imagine that DNA or RNA line up in particular ways that hold particular messages, maybe made by, a Zorgon fleet of Proxima Centauri or something. We may not be able to translate that completely, especially if we're not given any other information. But through those patterns, we might be able to say, well, there's something really artificial here, and it's not. It seems to be trying to communicate something, not for the cell to work, but communicating something specifically to us, kind of like a John 3:16 written out in the stars. There are scientists who are looking for this finite intelligent agency. There are astrobiologists who are specifically looking through genetic data to try to find this. A lot of them are connected with SETI and the Breakthrough Initiative. I'm still a bit skeptical about how confidently they'll ever be able to say that just off of that sort of structuring, but I do think there is something there that can be scientifically investigated.